price is right. For my daughter.
If there is one genre that seems to be never particularly popular with kind of mainstream audiences outside of a few big landmark titles like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, it is the sword and sorcery genre. I'm a huge fan of sword and sorcery genre since kind of the 80s, when we had, I would say, the golden age of the kind of the genre, with many kind of Conan the Barbarian imitators that came out both on cinema and straight to video, and I love them. And since then, as we've mentioned, we do get the odd kind of breakout series like The Witcher, Game of Thrones, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings kind of movies. But to be honest with you, they're kind of few and far between, and there is a lot of content that is produced that is just never really popular, where we never really see the kind of the fan base like you do with, for example, horror or science fiction or action, things like that. Sword and sorcery is always kind of the unpopular cousin, so to speak, of genre cinema. I, for one, am a huge fan of it, and I do enjoy some of the kind of the low budget movies that come out. And we are going to be talking about one such movie today called The Ranger's Bloodstone. And this one is written, directed, and stars David Nordquist, who, by the looks of it, is a huge fan of the Warhammer kind of role-playing miniature games that obviously we've seen that are very kind of popular. And he's actually kind of made another movie within this kind of series, and I think maybe a web series as well. And this is essentially financed via Kickstarter. And the story tells the story of this ranger, basically played by Nordquist, who is on the trail of a couple of orcs who he believes has kidnapped his young daughter, and he kind of wants revenge and obviously to kind of rescue his daughter. Along the way, he will face various challenges, potentially meet some allies and some adversaries along the way. What'll happen? You'll just have to watch the movie to find out. So this one is not going to kind of win over any fans of low-budget fantasy films, let me just kind of say that. But let's talk about what I think works in this movie. So this is clearly a low-budget film, and obviously we have to kind of rein in the expectations somewhat about what we can expect. However, I have, as I've mentioned, still enjoyed some of these kind of low-budget fantasy flicks, and there is stuff to enjoy with a lot of these films. So one of the things I do think is obvious with this particular movie is the passion behind the kind of the source material and that kind of genre, that fantasy sword and sorcery genre. Nordquist, obviously, looking at his IMDb page, a huge fan of kind of sword and sorcery, Warhammer, and that kind of style of medieval kind of fantasy, and that is clear to see with this movie. You can tell there's a lot of effort gone into it, from trying to disguise kind of Canadian accents into quasi-English accents, to the kind of the details in regards to the amount of extras sometimes in certain sequences, the Renaissance flair, the kind of the seemingly taking it particularly kind of seriously at times. Obviously it's all kind of set mainly in the woods, so it kind of lends itself to a kind of Skyrim-esque Elder Scrolls, Dungeons and Dragons style adventure, with obviously kind of this kind of fancy kind of period setting, so to speak. And I do think there is some kind of nice props and stuff here and there. The kind of the costuming, things like that, is all kind of quite fun. And the makeup effects, although kind of low budget, they do, for example, the way the orcs talk with kind of like a Cockney accent is kind of reminiscent of the orcs from the Lord of the Rings films, for example. There's obviously some influences from kind of popular culture within there, and I think there are some elements here to be enjoyed for, the kind of the fantasy fans who take this kind of stuff very seriously, and those of you who may like things like LARPing or go into Renaissance fairs and kind of stuff like that. I have to be honest with you though, this movie, I think for anyone outside of that kind of audience, may be a little bit of a hard one to kind of enjoy. I think here the problem is that it's just too tunnel visioned. The actual length of this movie is way too long. Let's start there. We have this extended flashback sequence in the middle of the movie that could have been completely cut out. I don't think it was necessary. It's essentially like a training montage, but it's way too long. So it's too long. And to be honest with you, the actual story that we do have, even kind of if you exclude the flashback sequence, it's go a certain length of time in the forest, meet some adversaries, have a fight. Go a little bit further, meet someone else, have a fight. Go a little bit further, meet someone and have a fight. It's kind of what the movie is, to be honest. It's really lacking in any kind of interesting narrative and kind of character beats here. So it comes across as somewhat kind of shallow. Now, the movie has a LARP quality feel to it. So live action roleplay, kind of, it feels like, I mean, the opening shots when we kind of see these kind of two orcs kind of, you know, having this kind of altercation with our main character. You know, it's kind of obviously like foam armor and things like this. So it has a very kind of cheap feel to it. And it actually just looks like people who we use these kind of costumes and stuff and, you know, kind of like just make a film out of it. Because that's genuinely what it looks like. To me, I think this could have been shot better to hide kind of like the cheapness. I think maybe they could have maybe shot it in maybe like slightly less well lit situations and have it kind of shot in the dark. Give it a kind of a more sort of spooky feel, especially if we're kind of dealing with obviously the orc sort of characters and stuff like that. There's not much in the way of, again, this is a low budget film. There's not much in the way of VFX and kind of stuff like this. I have to say the acting is, like I've said, I believe this is a Canadian movie and we have this kind of quasi kind of English accent, and it's just kind of, you know, I appreciate the attempt to have this kind of like this old English kind of feel to it, and that's obviously, you know, me being from Europe and everything, it's kind of sort of our history and stuff, which is a lot of these kind of fantasy movies and sorcery stuff is based on. But you know, I suppose it wasn't too bad, the actual accents and stuff, but the acting isn't good. I think the thing that kind of made me roll my eyes the most about this, though, is just the kind of like, the posturing in this film. A lot of the time, it's kind of, I mean, this is obviously spearheaded by Nordquist, who is, as I say, the star, the writer, the director. And a lot of the times, I think it's, you know, to make his character look cool. It almost seems like he kind of wants to insert himself into this kind of fantasy world as kind of like, you know, just him kind of playing out his kind of fantasies and stuff like that. And a lot of the times it's, you know, striking a kind of like heroic pose, you know, he'll kill you know, a bad guy or something, and then he'll kind of look moodily up and the camera will kind of linger and stuff. And it just like, it looks really cheesy. So you don't have any of that kind of like that gritty kind of realism that you would see in some type of even kind of fantasy films, where you have a kind of a slightly kind of gritty realism. I mean, think of something like maybe Excalibur, for example, where we do have the, you know, the knights slogging it in the mud and things like this. Here it's kind of lots of like, you know, posing to the camera in kind of cool kind of like action shots, kind of looking up moodily through the hair and things like this. It was just like the cheese level is kind of just like all the way up to kind of like 10 here. And I think for like a still shot, that kind of stuff, it might look good. But for a movie, it's just like, oh Jesus, this is kind of embarrassing, to be brutally honest. It just looks super cheesy. So I think this movie may appeal to certain fans who are just well into their kind of like LARPing and things like this. And I am a fan of sword and sorcery movies. It's kind of one of my favourite genres. I have a big film collection of kind of lots of even low budget kind of movies, but it's just kind of like, this is the sort of thing that I think puts mainstream audiences up. It's completely inaccessible to anyone kind of outside that kind of genre, really, and probably by design. But I think it needs to have producers and films like this, and it's not just this one, because there are other films like this as well. It needs to have producers on these films and said, let's try and make it a more accessible film. Let's have a little bit more of an interesting plot. Let's have a little bit more kind of, you know, characterization, a little bit more kind of grittiness, a little bit more kind of that we can connect with the kind of the characters here, and then not seem so kind of like hero worshipy or kind of like, you know, cheesy and stuff like that. And I think maybe you can get away with having these kind of low budget films be a bit more kind of having a bit more mainstream appeal, but that's dependent whether the filmmakers want to do that. It just seems to me that this film and films like it seem to be made for the people that who are making the film, rather than kind of any type of real kind of like, let's make a film that would appeal to any audience outside the very, very kind of small hardcore community that seems to be into kind of LARPing and stuff like that. So overall, I have to say the film is pretty unwatchable, I think, for the majority of the people. It's way too long, not particularly interested, and kind of just a bit cheesy and kind of ultimately uninteresting for the majority. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.